This is Grandmaster Daniel Nerditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on his countryman Aryan Tari at the 2023 Norway Chess Blitz tournament. And the two longtime friends, the two Olympiad teammates, are waiting to start the game. There's the handshake and a sip of water by Magnus Carlsen as he chooses 1e4 as his first move. And Aryan Tari is an opening specialist. He plays the Ruy Lopez with both colors. And let's see what Magnus Carlsen has to offer against the Cosio variation as the knight comes out to e7. This is considered a sideline of the Ruy Lopez, but it has been gaining quite a bit of popularity in classical chess over the years, and h4 is actually standard fare in this position as Carlsen trying to punish black for putting that knight on g6, and Aryan Tari is not caught off guard as he immediately slams his knight into d4. Now, that is another well-known idea in certain variations of the Ruy Lopez. That knight on d4, it attacks the bishop, it pressures the knight, and Tari asking Carlsen some questions, and he chooses to conserve his bishop, does Magnus Carlsen, and he brings it back to c4. And Aryan Tari, what an unconventional Ruy Lopez we have here, as he halts the progress of the h-pawn. But what happens if Carlsen jumps into g5, fried liver style? How is Tari going to defend the f7 pawn? He might want to go knight d4 back to e6. That might be the only way to intercept the bishop on c4 and the pawn on f7. Instead, Carlsen chooses a more Carlsen-esque approach. He prioritizes development, and he plays the move d3. He opens the diagonal for his dark-squared bishop, and neither side choosing to flinch in the center. Black certainly does not want to take on f3. That would enable Carlsen's queen to come out to an ideal square and threaten checkmate on f7. Instead, Tari, he prioritizes his own development and brings his bishop up to e7. And Carlsen looking a little bit surprised by that move. He can jump his own knight into d5, and that is exactly what he does. And that knight on d5, it threatens to exchange itself for the bishop, garnering the bishop pair. That's certainly unpleasant in a position as wide open as this. Tari, he might have underestimated this move, and he made the symmetrical move earlier in the game. And if he wants to conserve his own bishop, he can play bishop to c5, but then Carlsen's bishop could come out with great effect to g5, and the queen on d8 would be trapped. Tari would have to seriously weaken his kingside by pushing the f-pawn up to f6, and then he would have a very, very hard time getting his king out of the center. So already a lot of questions being asked by Magnus Carlsen. Has Tari's opening experiment failed? Well, that remains to be seen as Aryan intently studying the board. My guess is that d6 might be the most prudent option. He is definitely worse. Right now, he has to make sure that he gets the rest of his queenside out. His bishop on c8 is not participating in the game, and he can ill afford to hold the fort without the assistance of all of his minor pieces. Instead, he plays the move c6, and he actually forces Magnus Carlsen to exchange the knight for the bishop, and that is exactly what Carlsen does without hesitation, and he does, in fact, bring his bishop out to g5. This move does not come with as much effect as it would in different circumstances. Black's queen, it has plenty of escape squares, but where will it go? There is a check on b4 that's very tempting, and if it is met with c3, that is a spurious fork. Black could take on f3 with check, but then the f7 pawn would have been hanging at the end of the line, and so Tari is forced to play the move f6, and the benefit of this move is that it comes with tempo, and it gives black another tempo for development. The bishop back to e3 it goes, and Tari has to do something with his d4 knight. There's two attackers on that square and only one defender, and he might have to exchange on f3 and allow Carlsen to activate his queen. The smoke finally beginning to clear, and it's very obvious that Magnus Carlsen is in the clear, and he's got a pretty sizable advantage here. Black's position is loose. The knight on g6 is undefended. The black king, for the time being, is stuck in the center, and Aryan Tari is hesitating. He's down a minute on the clock, and he decides against taking on f3. Instead, he plays b5, and that is exactly what you do in these types of positions. You try to take over the initiative, and Tari uses that pawn as a lever and forces the white bishop to make a decision. And Carlsen hesitating a little bit. Bishop can drop back to b3, but there is an alternative. Carlsen can grab the knight on d4, not with his knight, because then the e-pawn would take and both bishops would be hanging. Instead, the white bishop can take the knight on d4, and after pawn takes d4, Tari would have to choose which bishop he actually takes. So a lot of tactics here to calculate, but Carlsen can also drop his bishop back to b3, and he decides on the simple approach, and Tari exchanges his knight for the bishop. We've got opposite colored bishops, and this position actually looks pretty serviceable for Aryan Tari, maybe slightly worse, but with opposite colored bishops, it's hard for white to exploit the latent weaknesses in black's position. And And Carlsen adopting a kind of maneuvering mindset here, dropping the knight back to d2 and mimicking Aryan Tari's kingside setup by pushing his own pawn up to f3, and the rook jumps into a6. Just the way Magnus Carlsen made that move tells you all you need to know. It attacks the c6 pawn, and Aryan Tari is under pressure on the queen side. And he has to defend that pawn. How will he do it? He will do it by pushing it up to c5. And the benefit of that move is that it locks the bishop on e3 out of the game. The bishop on e3 now does no longer pressure the a7 pawn. But that doesn't stop Magnus Carlsen from developing his queenside pressure. King f2, a very risky move, though, by Carlsen, who is fixating on the queen side. He's trying to get to that a7 pawn, but it's coming at a great cost. The king on f2 is now really loose, and the rook on f8 is eyeing the monarch angrily, and that is why Tari played the move f5, and he can now take on e4 and open up the f-file, and Magnus Carlsen has to be very careful not to overextend himself and not to get overly fixated on the queenside attack. And the time situation still in Magnus's favor, Tari with only 36 seconds left. And you can see the urgency there as he plays d5, and another sparkling move by the Norwegian prodigy. d5 by Tari. He has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns on the 5th rank. You don't see this every day. He is trying to shatter Magnus Carlsen's central control, and that will enable Tari to infiltrate and eventually access White's king. If Carlsen takes the pawn on d5, Tari cannot take it with the bishop. He has to take it with the queen because the knight on g6 would have been hanging laterally, and he is alert. He takes on d5 with the queen, and Carlsen showing some signs of anxiety here as the time situation is beginning to equalize, and the queen on d5 can deliver a check on d4, and the pawn on h4 is weak. So now it's Magnus Carlsen's position that starts to appear somewhat loose, and Tari calmly drops his bishop back to f7. Excellent move there, making sure that his minor pieces are defending each other. And Carlsen hungrily grabs the a7 pawn. Finally, after so many moves, he takes his loot, but it's only a corner pawn, and his king on f2 is feeling mighty lonely. But can Aryan Tari find a way to punish Carlsen for his greed with his last seconds? A glance at the clock and a capture on h4, and what a tactic by Tari! And if the bishop captures the knight, queen delivers a check on d4, forking the king and the bishop, and if the king moves up to g3 in that position, the queen slides over to f4, and at the very least, black can pick up the knight on d2 and start just garnering all of White's queenside pawns. Magnus Carlsen clearly missed that move, and he's going to take a chunk of time here to figure things out, and he plays the move c4, and he counterattacks the queen, but he gives up d3, and the knight on d2 is still in the crosshairs of the queen. But Carlsen's idea is this: he takes on c5, and the queen rejoins society, but so does the knight as it drops back to g6, and it defends the e5 pawn. Carlsen continues to grab and gorge on the pawns on the queen side. He's got tripled pawns now on the b file, but it's Tari who strikes first. e4 is on the board, and Carlsen can't really take that pawn. That would open the f-file. His only source of counterplay is that passed b pawn. Who will strike first? Will it be Tari's attack on White's king? Will it be Carlsen's passed pawns? And a grimace there as Aryan had to drop his queen back to d7. Carlsen seems to be taking over the initiative, but his king is still so weak, and in a time scramble, that might be the deciding factor as Aryan with another excellent move. f4 is on the board, and the queen on d7. It threatens to infiltrate to g4. Carlsen, he's got only a couple of seconds. He takes on f3. Here comes the queen. Onto h3 it goes, and the knight is jumping into h4, and Aryan Tari is suddenly at a peak of activity. Carlsen is panicking. He has to get rid of the knight. The king on f1 is getting hunted down by Black's queen. Tari has a perpetual in his pocket, but it's Magnus Carlsen playing for the win, and the queen shuttling back and forth hither and thither, taking b3. There goes one of White's tripled pawns, and Carlsen has to bring his queen back. Queen c2 check by Tari, and g6 defending against checkmate. There was a mate threat on g7 and knight e4, but bishop c4 check, and Carlsen with the final blunder. And queen e2 is checkmate, or White has to give up his queen, and there is no sense in continuing. And Aryan Tari stuns Magnus Carlsen in the Armageddon, wins a huge blitz game with Black. What a game this was, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these blitz videos. Thank you so much for watching.